You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature webcast and podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives take an in-depth, objective, and nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. In this series, we'll sit down and talk to experts in their fields and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss the monumental task that will fall upon a lot of nations to rebuild Ukraine after the Russian conflict. The reconstruction efforts will be complex, costly, and will rival anything we've seen, I guess, since World War II. And who will lead this effort and what will truly be needed? I'm very pleased to have join us today retired Lieutenant General Jim Huggins, who's a partner currently at the McChrystal Group. He is the former Chief Operating Officer of the United States Army. Welcome, General Huggins.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's great to be here.
So, Jim, I know that your focus was, broadly in the military on, planning and defending our country. But part of the focus of the military has always been to go back and secure the peace and to rebuild countries that are ravaged by these kinds of I'll call it a disaster. How do you view the destruction in Ukraine? We've heard President Zelensky say that over a third of Ukraine's infrastructure has been destroyed, but just very few of our listeners have been on the ground, in a military in a situation or post-military. Describe what is there, what kind of destruction is there, and what's going to be necessary to rebuild.
A tremendous amount, obviously, is an understatement. I've seen estimates up to over €1 trillion in terms of the reconstruction effort. That's the physical piece, but then there's also the mental piece that ties into this. I mean, at least from my eyes, looking at the people in Ukraine who are, fleeing and fighting, there's another mental piece of this thing, the toll that's coming along with that one. And who knows how long that will take and what damage that will have for the long term. But just the physical infrastructure, which has been devastated where most of the fighting has been done, is an effort that is, I probably would say, not years, but maybe decades in terms of reconstruction.
I'm sure you haven't been, to Ukraine, but you've been to, battlefields and cities that have been, that look like this. Describe for our listeners, what they could expect to see if they were walking down the streets of Kyiv right now.
There's no essential services. And food is obviously very limited. And people are probably not very stable in terms of where they're residing because they're having to move from place to place to place. So that all leads to absolute uncertainty in terms of what tomorrow brings, which is probably the most disturbing state people have to live in. I mean, their homes are gone. Largely, many of these people, everything that I've seen and been in that area firsthand, it's generations of family home that are just gone. And it is something that is not going to be turned around in a short period of time. I mean, the real question is when, and we can't even decide when that would start based upon the current state of the conflict.
Yeah, and upwards to 15, 20% of their population has been displaced, and they have no place to go. How about the infrastructure? I mean, water, sewer, electricity, lighting, all the things that people just take for granted.
Obviously, where the heaviest fighting is, that's non-existent at this point in time. And I would say that it's not unlike what we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, to be honest with you, in terms of sometimes after disaster relief missions going in, we see that in countries, even in Haiti, and it's in the Western world, but there's none of those services are available in times of crisis along the way. So it really sets in the mindset of the individual that's living there. Unfortunately, is what's next? I mean, what do I have to hope for at this point in time?
So let's kind of fast forward to a situation where the fighting is stopped. Nobody really knows exactly how this is going to end, and so it's a little bit, we have to just describe scenarios. But let's assume that Russia, continues to occupy a certain amount of geography, certainly the Crimea and possibly some part of the Donbass, I would think. What role does Russia play, at least in those areas? Do they rebuild, all their own destruction, or do they help rebuild the rest of the country? Or does it all fall on the West?
I don't think there's going to be any calculation in terms, unless it's just a piece of territory that the Russians hold. But I don't think reconstruction is going to be on the top of their list, given what their military goals were, given what their political goals were. For a country that fought them tooth and nail, I'm pretty sure they're not going to be that interested in restoring services.
Yeah, I mean, it would seem, given the amount of destruction that they've done, which has been surprising. But and you should comment on that too. That if they wanted it intact, that they would have secured it in some fashion that didn't destroy everything, right?
It is. That would be ideal. But as we've discussed before, it's perhaps given the capabilities of their military, they have no other alternative. They have to stand off. They have to try and rubble villages and towns, because if they go in, their forces are going to be annihilated.
So you have this. So you've got massive discussion, and a third of the country. By saying it that way, it's probably most of the physical infrastructure, as you said, a lot of the housing, and it's in the key urban areas. And even if you destroy a section of the city, it then impedes the access to others. So I mean, this is going to take a long time. I mean, even if it's only €1 trillion, everybody always underestimates these kinds of things early on. But even if it's only that, that it's going to take years, if not decades, to restore this poor country to its former state. Wouldn't you think?
I think so. Absolutely. But, the other question in my mind, Steve, is, say there is a residual Russian occupation, which I personally hope there is not, but I see that that's probably a logical outcome. So who's to say the same challenges we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we were trying to build infrastructure, as we started what we would say militarily as phase 4, where you try and go into post-conflict operations. You're still in the fight, but you're actually trying to build capability. And so, I don't know the answer, but my speculation is as hard as the Ukrainians are fighting, I'm not sure that if there is a stay behind force that is trying to occupy, that will not suffer from some other activity that comes along with it. I mean, I think people will fight. I think it will be an insurgency inside of Ukraine by the people who said, no, I'm not going to tolerate the Russian occupation.
There's not only historical precedent elsewhere, but there's historical precedent right here. Over the past, half a dozen years post the Crimean situation, there's been resistance in the Donbass region as Russia has sort of prosecuted a proxy war in that far eastern region of Ukraine. So that that's essentially what's been going on is a resistance effort for half a dozen years. I mean, people to talk about that, because I don't think people really realize, that you see this on television, and they go, oh, that's nice. Now, let's go to dinner. And then that's, but they're dealing with it, 7/24 for 6 years.
Really, I think since 2014, some form of that. And everybody thinks it was in February, but it really has been going on for quite some time. I think it just reached a point where we would say that Russia and Putin said, for a lot of reasons, we're going to go and intervene. Intervene is a light word for what they've done. But I just, in terms of the question is what's the end state for this conflict going to be? When can post-conflict operations begin? When can reconstruction begin? And then, as you said, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to come in and do this? I don't need to remind you, we're not on the ground. The U.S. military is not there. The question is it going to be a NATO presence? Is it going to be combined presence? Or is it just going to be monetary and we're going to just pour money into this situation? All those. Or are we going to say, United States Army, go sit on the ground and see what you can do to help?
What's the likelihood of that?
From all I know right now, and again, as we've said, speculation, I cannot see that in the scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're not a NATO state, so you can't see, NATO forces going in to secure it. And we haven't put boots on the ground, in the conflict to help them either. I know weaponry's been sent in, but not as much as they wanted or needed. And so it's been sparse. Is there any reason to believe that the reconstruction effort would be, any different in terms of how it was conducted?
In terms of a military force, I don't think there's any reason. But I mean, certainly post-conflict operations could have a large contracting presence. Those could be expats. Those could be a lot of other people. But there's support like that going on and still in Iraq. And I could see that becoming an alternative, where it becomes more of a privatized that works off of international funding, that works on reconstruction. I mean, I could see that as a scenario as opposed to boots on the ground.
We're talking about the devastation in Ukraine and what's going to be required to put it back together again. I'll be right back after this short break with my conversation with retired Lieutenant General Jim Huggins.
As war rages in Ukraine, the Conference Board is closely monitoring the situation and producing timely and relevant content on a daily basis that will help the business community navigate this global geopolitical unrest. What will the impact be on oil prices, food prices, our supply chain, and what about cybersecurity? How will this conflict impact the way your organization does business around the world? And how will you communicate this crisis to customers and employees? We're gathering the very latest content on our website. Just head to conference-board.org and find trusted insights to help you and your team lead with confidence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by retired Lieutenant General Jim Huggins, former COO of the United States Army and now a partner at the McChrystal Group. Okay, so General, beyond the physical repair, what other rebuilding efforts are going to be required? Because, all education has stopped, universities, have stopped. You've got, children displaced in other countries. You've got 6-7 million people that have been displaced. So how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
I would hope that it would start with a plan that is going to say what do we think the end state is in terms of the rebuild, and then probably breaks that into achievable outcomes over time, as opposed to just saying, okay, we're going to restore the government, we're going to provide all services. So that in other words, they're going to have to take this in phases. Go figure. I was in the military, so we like to phase everything we do. So I think that's what we'll have to do. And all things won't happen to all of the damaged areas at one point in time. I think a logical plan would try and focus on what the priority impacts that could be done. That said, I think there's another part of this reconstruction that comes into what you mentioned, is those displaced families are not going to be returning overnight back into Ukraine when we reached that point where they can. So there's also a cost associated with that. And how is that going to be borne?
Yeah, I mean, this could be a permanent loss in intellectual capital to the country.
Unless it is, hopefully that is one of the objectives. How do I not allow this drain to occur, this brain drain to occur?
But you were talking before the break, and I think it's a really important point that you're making, which is that, we know how to do this when it's our situation, when it's our conflict, when the U.S. military is in control. We have the start of phase 4. We know what that means. We have experience in that. The United States military and NATO is not involved in this deliberately. And we've kept an arm's length, or more than an arm's length, distance from this thing so as not to inflame the situation and make it worse. Who takes the lead? I mean, is the United Nations, at all capable of doing something like this?
I think it'll be a team effort across the board, but I do think the United Nations can certainly that would send the strongest message if it is unified at that level. But I do think it is not just a matter of a pen and a declaration. It is going to take an awful lot of commitment along the way. And sometimes we lose sight of that commitment if we don't get it done very quickly, which is probably the biggest drawback of this one. It will not happen quickly, as you and everybody listening knows.
Yeah. Now, so how does the United Nations do this when you've got two Security Council members being Russia and China, who are bonded in this new axis? They can block all of this. Do you see that impeding any efforts?
It's certainly a possibility, but in my view, at some point in time, if this reaches a conclusion, and I think those votes will be addressed in that conclusion.
So we've talked before about the expansion of NATO. It's no secret that Ukraine would like to be part of NATO. It was thought that bordering states would not be expanded, but yet you have Finland and Sweden that have applied. Could you see an outcome from this that Ukraine applies to NATO and that NATO actually then, as their first act, engages in the rebuilding effort?
It really depends on the terms. In terms of, I know back in March, Zelensky had mentioned, some possibilities of what the future would hold. The terms of whenever, soon, if possible, this reaches some sort of a conclusion will impact that. But I think that it is an inevitability that Ukraine will try to become a part of NATO again, and that should be considered. But that's just one man's opinion. And I think that then leads it to how then do you work the reconstruction?
Yeah, and then how do you fund it? So what role do businesses in the West and the private sector have to play in this?
I don't think it's a matter of philanthropy, but I think it's a matter of partnership in terms of how that reconstruction would go. There will be opportunity. Where the actual funding comes from is going to have to be determined by the very large community that is impacted, the world. And then I think there are going to be ventures where reconstruction can be partnered along the way with US businesses, international businesses along the way. And I think that will not happen quickly, as we've said before. So this will be something for the long term, which maybe myopically would look at only larger corporations would probably be able to go down a venture like this, but I'm not sure yet. I don't know if we've ever entered into something like this, if we choose to step in and try to help.
But it's an interesting point that you're making because, President Zelensky has proven to be a very savvy character. He's reached out from a PR standpoint. He addressed the Cannes Film Festival. He's addressed business groups and asked them to get involved. This whole notion of a public-private partnership where businesses potentially engage with the government and to go back in to rebuild sectors that are relevant to them, with the carry-on, the tail effect of those businesses having, some commercial, follow-on and benefit thereafter is not out of the question, but that's not the typical way that this is done. So it could be really unique here.
I would agree. It's not the typical way, but there has to be a partnership, some sort of venture that makes this, because it just can't be done on a shoestring and saying, okay, this is all philanthropy. This is somebody, we're just going to rebuild and it'll be net zero. Something has to be done different in my view. And then there's going to be equity that ties into this. What's the long-term solution? And then, what's the presence that's going to exist in a follow-on? Hopefully we can return to normalcy. And then is there an opportunity now for equity, for some sort of table stakes to be in the country?
And you could imagine that President Zelensky would want that. If not an immediate, admission to NATO, at least better ties or closer ties to the EU and the US through the business community, through trade, through ownership. It puts more skin on the table outside of the region. You could, and certainly investment. There's the monetary part of it, but also the ongoing and the longer term ties, which I'm sure he would love to have. So this notion is not crazy. There is some real strategic possibility here.
And from everything I've observed, Zelensky could probably work that deal pretty well.
Yeah. So following World War II, there was a Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan had a leader, an administrator, which ironically was a former chair of our organization. Our public policy center is the Committee for Economic Development. Paul Hoffman was the chair of that effort, and went on to become the administrator. So it seems to me there needs to be some body, whether it's a public body, a private body, the United Nations, an NGO, some group that says, or that is recognized as the leader in the planning effort. Because I think this is the thing that you keep saying, there needs to be a plan. Somebody has got to govern a plan that then leads to this execution. Where do you think that planning effort, that the ownership for that planning effort should reside?
I don't know if I have the exact right answer, Steve, but if it doesn't involve the leadership of Ukraine, it's probably going to be poorly designed. So I would say, it's like us trying to determine a solution in Iraq or Afghanistan and not giving them a vote in terms of what we're trying to achieve.
So it's got to be the public partnership with the government of Ukraine. Do they then own the plan?
I believe lots of people have to support and play. And I got it. There are people saying, well, it's just going to be nepotism. People are going to fill their pockets with money. It's not. Look, let's try and say we can probably do better than that. But the outcome is really a Ukrainian outcome that we're trying to get, if we can get to peace soon. And then we all support.
So the logic in that is that the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government will probably need to take the lead, just given the situation, but that it's going to require interaction from, non-government agencies, from governments, from business. In other words, it's going to be a full court press. But there is a potential role here for business, is what I hear you saying. And so our listeners and CEOs and multinational firms should be thinking about the post-conflict world and how to engage in this effort.
I'm sure there are people out there saying, why is this former general talking about bringing business into this effort? And I mean, we are lucky we partner. When I was in the military, and I'm still watching my friends do it with, an organization called BENS, Business Executives for National Security. It is incredible. I know that sometimes when you're in the military, you think, well, we can teach corporate America a thing or two, but guess what? Corporate America can teach the military a thing or two. And then in terms of this long-term effort in the rebuild, it would seem to me that the commercial world would actually be sort of tailor-made. Will there have to be some oversights? Will there have to be some involvement from governments? Yes, there will be. But let's not try and solve the problem with just military force.
Yeah, it's sort of an all of the above. And clearly, Ukraine's GDP was driven by the food and energy sectors. They were the breadbasket. And I'm not sure much planting is getting done over there. So if I was President Zelensky in a post world, I would try to get the basic needs covered, but I'd also try to get crops in the ground and get the energy production going again, so that you had the hard currency to help pay for this. Last question is kind of I'll throw you a wild card. You can what so any reparations levied towards Russia? Do you think Russia will could there be any forcing of repayment for all this damage that they've done?
I'm voting with my heart again. I'm going to say I sure do hope so. I sure do hope so. I mean, that's something for the world, the international community to really address along the way. In the back of my mind, I'm still trying to wonder, when the Russian oligarchs will be out there going, hey, I really can't afford too much more of these statutes, these limitations that are being placed on us. We might need somebody else to run this show. I don't know. But in terms of an outcome, I would like to hold people accountable. Go figure. That's what I lived my life doing for 35 years. That accountability is key.
Yeah, and the question is, how do you do that? And you don't know at this point because you don't know the outcomes and and who's going to control what. But you would sure hope so with all this. You don't just waltz in and do $1 trillion worth of damage to a country and then just walk away from it and leave a mess. So it's going to be interesting. General Huggins, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
It's my pleasure, Steve, and best of luck. I'm hoping some of the listeners got something out of it, but if they've got better answers, please have them contact you or I, and I'll gladly listen.
Well, it's a great point, and I think that by starting this discussion early, hopefully it will lead to some creative solutions, and because you don't want to wait too long. I mean, you need to get the planning going early, and I think the thinking for the Marshall Plan actually started in 1942, which I'm not sure people realize. Even though it didn't really kick off until after VE Day in 1945. So. And we'll see, but it's not too soon to start thinking about it, and we really appreciate your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, ESG, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your friends, your colleagues, and anyone who will listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this series is brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, your source of trusted insights for what's ahead. For the latest insights to help guide your business through this time of geopolitical unrest, we have daily and relevant updates on our website at conference-board.org.